So we're going to continue looking at the problems with unemployment figures, and thereafter we're going to start looking at inflation. And the next bullet basically says to you that the unemployment figures, it tends to overstate the unemployment rate because employment insurance and most welfare programs require recipients to seek employment. And it says here now that the unemployment figures basically sometimes become overstated because some persons who would prefer to work part-time can find only full-time work. So if you were to look at a crude example, what is saying to you, for instance, if you have X amount of persons in the economy, let's say they're 10. 5 of them are working full-time jobs. 5 of them are unemployed, looking for jobs. If the employer had allowed these persons to work part-time, so you basically break up the work day. You can say have one coming 8 to 12, another 12 to 4, sorry. If that were the case, then it's possible then that everyone within the economy could be employed, because when we speak of being employed, we make no distinction as to whether or not you're working part-time or full-time. Once you have a job, you are considered to be employed. So what this is saying to you is that the unemployment rate can be overstated because persons might be working full-time, but they prefer to work part-time, and in working part-time, more persons can actually be employed, as the case may be. It also says that some are forced to work overtime. Same thing. If there's a job to be done and you don't want to work overtime, then it simply means then that if your boss wants that to be done, he has to employ somebody else. People are forced to work weekends. You don't want to work weekend, but there's a job to be done. If there's unemployment in the economy, then that employer could have easily fixed that problem by employing those persons who find themselves out of work and allow you to have the free time on the weekend, as the case may be. So this is what he's saying to you, is that because of these dynamics taking place within the economy, you can have cases of the employment statistics being overstated. And obviously, we have our underground economy, whereby people in the underground economy may not readily acknowledge such jobs because their intent is to evade taxes or whatever the case may be. So that's it in terms of the whole concept of unemployment. We're now going to make a segue in understanding what is meant by the term inflation. And again, we have to follow and study inflation in the economy because inflation reduces the purchasing power of money. A dollar today is not the same as a dollar tomorrow in terms of spending power if prices are going up. Okay? However, we want to see, as economists, some gradual increases in prices, because with that gradual increase, it's going to stimulate some level of economic activity. So what you do find, in some cases, in the more developed economies, they actually find themselves engaged in what's called inflation targeting. They want to see prices increase by that certain amount of percentage from one year to the next, because it assists in terms of actual economic growth. So when we speak of inflation, inflation refers to a sustained increase in the average price level. And the most widely used measure to do that is the Consumer Price Index. We've already been exposed to the CPI, so I would not necessarily go back and make a way in terms of definition. So we have inflation, we have hyperinflation, which is extremely high inflation. We also have what's called deflation. So when you hear the word deflate, it means that it is a reduction. So deflation refers to a sustained decline in the average price level. And then we have what's called disinflation, which is a reduction in the rate of inflation. So it basically means then that prices are increasing, but at a reduced rate from one year to the next. Disinflation, as the term may be. So again, inflation is typically measured annually, also done monthly and quarterly. So the annual inflation rate, again, is just the percentage change increase in the average CPI level from one year to the next. Okay, we would have already done this in terms of calculating, where we use actual statistics from Antigua and Barbuda in terms of us understanding how the inflation rate is tabulated from one month to the next. As I've already indicated to you, some economies actually go about target the inflation rate. So the UK, for instance, they have a target rate of plus 2 or minus plus 2% or minus 2%. So if you have a situation whereby prices go above that or below that band, the central bank will then intervene and make some adjustments to the money supply, interest rates, as the case may be, to either make prices go up or go down, as the case may be. The next slide just basically gives you a crude example as to what the CPI looks like for Antigua and Barbuda. We would have already done that in one of our earlier modules, where we actually use data up to January 2015. So everybody knows then how to calculate the CPI. When we speak of inflation and hyperinflation, one of the more telling cases that come to mind is what Zimbabwe would have experienced. So this next slide, slide 24, just gives you an idea or make you have a wider appreciation as to the potential impact of hyperinflation. Venezuela is being described as one of those economies at this current point as having high levels of inflation. So with inflation, money, the purchasing power is money is reduced, then government, central banks, as the case may be, will have to find themselves engaged in the printing of money in order to make purchases. Because, I mean, a dollar will not be able to buy anything of high worth. So basically what he's saying to you is that in order for them to keep abreast of with the inflation and not forcing persons to carry huge quantity of money, they have to then print higher denomination of currency. So look at this one, for instance. There's an example where the Zimbabwe government back then had issued, well, the central bank had issued a banknote for $10 million, which in the scheme of things basically has very low value. So if we were to then move to slide 27, where we're going to discuss the two sources of inflation. What are the sources, the primary sources of inflation? And the first one basically speaks to demand pull, and the second one speaks to what's called cost push inflation. So when we speak of demand pull inflation, this basically involves prices rising as real GDP rises and unemployment falls. So basically we have a situation whereby if an economy is growing, persons have a lot of disposable income, then you're going to have cases whereby too much money is going to find itself chasing too few goods, thereby leading to inflation. So that's it in terms of what it means by demand pull inflation. It's more consumer driven by virtue of economic growth. So the next slide, slide 29, basically shows you what happens in terms of the economy experiencing what's called demand pull inflation, which is basically showed you here. Let's say within our aggregate demand curve, we have our y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m. Let's say consumers increase their demand, causing the aggregate demand curve to shift outwards to the right. Obviously, what he's saying to you is that by virtue of that, prices are going to increase. All right? And that, again, is going to be leading to what's called your demand pull inflation. So what are the factors that actually lead to demand pull inflation within the macroeconomy? First and foremost, we already would have discussed the factors that will cause the consumption function to shift. So these are some of the factors then, because remember we said that demand pull is largely driven by consumers. A reduction in direct or indirect taxation. If taxes are reduced, consumers will have more disposable income, causing demand to rise. A reduction, for instance, in indirect taxes, such as the ABST that we have here in Antigua, will mean that a given amount of income will now buy a greater volume of goods and services. If firms are slow to adapt to that change in the demand pattern, it could then lead to an increase in prices. The next one speaks to rapid growth of the money supply as a consequence of increased bank and building society borrowing if interest rates are low and consumer confidence is high. So if consumer confidence is high, interest rates are low, the demand for money is high, a lot of economic activities taking place, prices are going to increase. The next one again speaks to rising consumer confidence. And remember I told you that no matter how low interest rates may be, what really thrives, what really drives the macroeconomy is that of consumer confidence, investor confidence, as the case may be. So rising consumer confidence, which would lead to an increase in total household demand for goods and services, is going to create inflation. The next one speaks to faster economic growth in other countries. Remember, within the macroeconomy, we have what's called our balance of trade, the export of goods and services, the import of goods and services. So if you have faster economic growth in other countries, which is providing a boost to export overseas, now, remember that export sales provide an extra flow of income and spending into the country's circular flow of income. Exports are counted as an injection of aggregate demand. That then can lead to an increase in prices within the macro economy. So you understand fully that demand pull inflation is consumer driven, whereas now we're going to make our segue into cost push inflation, slide 31, which is on the supply side. So what is cost push inflation? Cost push inflation is a phenomenon in which the general price level rise due to increase in the cost of the production factors, wages, raw materials, as the case may be. It says here now that cost push inflation developed because the higher cost of production decreases in aggregate supply, the amount of total production in the economy. Because there are fewer goods being produced, so supply is actually weakening and demand for these goods remain consistent, the price of the finished goods will actually increase. So what are the various factors that you actually see leading to cost push inflation? Cost push inflation can manifest itself from an increase in imports of raw materials and work in progress from a country that is currently experiencing a rate of inflation that is higher than the domestic economy. So for us in Antigua, that's important because all raw materials, whatever the case may be, by and large are imported. So if the cost of these are increasing in America, it stands to mean that when they come to Antigua, they're going to be also at a more higher cost. The next one speaks to an increase in the imports of finished goods and services, especially consumer and durable items from a country that is currently experiencing a rate of inflation that is higher than the domestic economy. Again, you can see that come into play in Antigua and Barbuda because of the fact that we import practically everything. So if the cost of production in the US is increasing, when the finished goods get to Antigua, the prices are also going to be higher. Because remember what we say is that at the end of the day, firms are in the business of what? Making some form of profit in the long run. There's no social good no social good per se in firms' interaction in the market. At the end of the day, profit is one of those underlying motive in terms of firms deciding to be engaged in production. So This is it in terms of part 3 for chapter on unemployment and inflation. We'll continue again looking at cost push inflation. And